I heard my colleague on the other side of the aisle from Louisiana over on the floor of the Senate with the usual sharp partisan scalpel talking about what the price of gasoline was when this Congress was seated, the new Congress, presumably with the Democratic majority was his point, and what the price of gasoline is now, suggesting somehow that the Congress has conspired in increasing the price of gasoline. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth, but I want to explain my concern about what's happening with the price of gasoline and the price of energy in this country. And I also want to make the point while I do this, that those, including perhaps my colleague who was speaking earlier this morning, those who have always felt that regulation was a four-letter word, ought to understand that part of what we're experiencing today is regulatory agencies in the federal government taking a Rip Van Winkle nap while they ought to be regulating, while they ought to be watching on behalf of the public interest what's going on. We have people that came to government who didn't like government, who aspired not to do anything, but they wanted to. And a good example of that is the folks that were put in place prior to Enron running roughshod on wholesale electricity prices, which we later found out was a criminal enterprise. And people on the West Coast were built out of billions and billions and billions of dollars. Why? Because regulators weren't watching and didn't care. Regulators were selected by the very companies they were regulating. In fact, interviews were conducted. I'm told that Ken Lay actually was conducting some interviews on behalf of the administration. Now, Ken Lay is dead. He's gone. He came before my committee. I chaired the hearings on the Enron scandal over in the Commerce Committee. He came before the committee. We subpoenaed him. He raised his hand, took an oath, then sat down, took the Fifth Amendment. He now died, but many of his colleagues in Enron are spending years at minimum security prisons somewhere around the country. So effective regulatory oversight is very important. It's just unbelievably important. Now let me explain why that's the case with respect to the price of gasoline and the price of oil. Here's what's happened to the price of gasoline. These are oil prices, but gasoline prices track them. This is oil price on NYMEX, 1 month contract, first month contract. You can see what's happening, up, up, and up. Now, is there a reason that oil prices should go up like that? Well, let's explore that just a bit. Stephen Simon, Senior Vice President of ExxonMobil, April of this year, that's a month and a half ago, testified before the U.S. House of Representatives, and here's what he said. He said the price of oil should be about $50 or $55 a barrel. Big oil executive saying the price of oil ought to be about $50 or $55 a barrel. Here's Clarence Cazalat, the CEO of Marathon Oil. He says $100 oil is not justified by the physical demand in the market. Oil executive saying current price at $100, it's much higher now, at $100 it's not justified. During a question and answer period, he suggested a more reasonable range for crude oil prices was between $55 and $60 a barrel. This is a New Jersey Star-Ledger report, January. Experts, including the former head of ExxonMobil, say financial speculation in the energy markets has grown so much over the last 30 years it now adds 20 to 30% or more to the price of a barrel of oil. Again, oil company executive. Fidel Gate, Oppenheimer, senior energy analyst at Oppenheimer, 35 years of experience. Quote, there is absolutely no shortage of oil. I'm convinced that oil prices shouldn't be a dime above $55 a barrel. I call it the world's largest gambling hall. He's talking about the futures market now for oil. I call it the world's largest gambling hall. It's open 24/7. Unfortunately, it's totally unregulated. This is like a highway with no cops and no speed limit, everybody going 120 miles an hour. Now, Fidel Gate came and testified before our Energy Committee, said the same thing. There's no justification for the current price of oil. So then what's happening? Well, this is what a market looks like at NYMEX. It's hard to see much order there, but I've actually visited that market. It's a bunch of traders on the floor. They wear colored jackets and logos, and they've got pieces of paper, and it doesn't look like anybody can keep track much of what they're doing, but they apparently do it well. At any rate, in this market, which is supposed to provide liquidity for the price of oil, that is, you have a market in which you have people that hedge and people that buy contracts and so on, there is now an orgy of speculation, an unbelievable amount of speculation. Let me show you what has happened with respect to speculation. This line shows the percentage of oil owned by speculators, 1996, 2008. This is oil purchased by people that don't have any interest in having oil. These are speculators. They buy things they'll never get from people that never had it, expecting to make money on both sides of the trade. So, this market is now infested with speculators. We had a testimony yesterday that said the largest holder of home heating fuel in the Northeast in the United States of America is Morgan Stanley, an investment bank. Does anybody here think that Morgan Stanley decided as part of its corporate charter, we really aspire to gather a bunch of heating oil because we want to be in the heating oil business? No. It's an investment bank that's in the speculative business. Now, hedge funds and investment banks are deep into speculation of these futures markets. Very deep. Investment banks, for the first time, as I understand it, are actually buying storage capacity to take energy, that is, heating fuel and oil, off of the market and put it in storage, to keep it in the market. They feel it would be more valuable in the future than to convert it to dollars, which they think will depreciate. So they just buy oil and store oil because they are speculating. Well, the question is, what do we do about that? If, in fact, the fundamentals aren't at work here, and by the way, there's no free market. Everybody says, well, what about the free market? Let the free market work. There's no free market. That's absurd. You got a cartel, a bunch of folks that represent the OPEC countries. They all have ministers. They Mr. Minister this, Mr. Minister that. They go lock a door someplace, and this cartel decides how much they're going to produce and what sort of price point they want. So you got a cartel at the front end. Second, you got bigger oil companies. They've all merged up. They all like each other, so they married up. And the fact is, nobody cared much how big they got. Now they've all got two names, ExxonMobil, Phillips Conoco, and the list goes on. So they're bigger, stronger, have more muscle in the marketplace. Cartel, bigger oil companies. And third, and most important, you've got an unbelievable amount of speculation in a market that ought to work but doesn't work anymore at all. Who's injured? The country's damaged. Our economy is damaged. Everybody that drives up to a gas tank or a service station and wants to use a gas pump to fill their car with gas is now actually siphoning money right out of their pocketbook, right into the bank account of the major oil companies, right into the bank account of the OPEC countries. I mean, they've got permagrin. They love this. I mean, they smile all the way to the bank because they're depositing our money. But it's injuring our country, damaging our economy, and hurting American consumers. So if this is not about fundamentals, and if the fundamentals don't justify the current price, what then can we do? We've done at least a couple of little things. I introduced a bill that we've now passed. The President's now signed it. He didn't like to sign it, but he signed it, that says at least stop putting 70,000 barrels a day underground as sweet light crude. So that's now law, although they've not yet stopped putting it underground because they're filling out the current contract until the end of June. But 70,000 more barrels of sweet light crude will go into the supply pipeline when that takes effect at the end of this month. But what else can we do with respect to speculation to end and wring out the speculation? Let me say, first of all, we need oil. I'm not here to trash oil. We need oil. I understand that. We put in place in 1916 generous tax breaks that are permanent to say, if you're looking for oil or gas, we want to give you some tax incentives to do that. That's what this country did a long, long time ago. I was on an oil rig about 2 weeks ago in the area of our country that has the largest oil play, I believe. It's called the Bakken Shale in western North Dakota and eastern Montana. It is fascinating what they're doing. And the reason I say that we need oil, I encourage drilling. I was one of 4 senators that helped open up Lease 181 off the Gulf of Mexico. We're now going to get more oil and gas off of that Gulf area and still protect our environment. At the drilling rig where I visited 2 weeks ago to talk about the sophistication of what we're doing, they drill down 10,000 feet, make a big curve with the same rig, and drill out 10,000 feet. They're searching for a seam that's 100 feet wide, a 100-foot seam called the shale seam. And they divide that seam into three parts, the upper part, the middle part, and the lower part. They go down 2 miles with a drilling rig, make a big curve and go out 2 miles, and they're targeting only the middle part of a 100-foot seam to get the oil. And they end up, after 2 miles and a big curve and out 2 miles, they end up 2 to 4 feet from where they expect to be with their drill bit. Unbelievable technology. There's a lot going on, and I commend them for it. And we want to encourage them. We want more production. But we can't sit around here as a United States Congress and say, you know what, it doesn't matter what the current price is. If the price at the pumps is $4, the price of a barrel of oil is $125 or $30 or $135, doesn't matter. It matters to the airlines that went belly up recently. I had a discussion yesterday with an executive who told me the name of an airline he thinks may well be liquidated the next couple of weeks. I was flabbergasted. We've had a good many airlines file for bankruptcy recently. We've got trucking companies all across this country, especially mom-and-pop trucking businesses that can't afford to buy fuel and have gone belly up, and many others will. We've got people that can't afford to put gas in their tank to drive to work. That's unbelievable to me. And if it were about fundamentals, I'd understand it, but this has nothing to do with fundamentals of supply and demand. And it has nothing to do with the free market. It has to do with an unbelievable amount of speculation. And we have a right, in my judgment, we have a responsibility to begin wringing that speculation out of those futures markets. And there are a number of ways to do that. I've talked before about a piece of legislation that would increase margin requirements for those that want to engage in speculation. You know, if you want to buy stock on margin, you have to put up 50% of the money. That's just a requirement, 50% of the money. You want to go buy an oil contract, 5 to 7%. You want to control $100,000 worth of oil? Cost you $5,000 to $7,000. You want to control $100,000 worth of stock on margin? It'll cost you $50,000. Now, it seems to me that first we ought to identify a way to decide what is speculation and what is not, and then go after a way to wring out the speculation from these markets. I understand markets need to work. They need liquidity. They need to have an opportunity for legitimate hedging. I understand all of that. But I also understand what's happened here is we've galloped into this box canyon with speculators making massive amounts of money. The other day I was on the floor and I talked about a man, I think his name was McCall, who, I'm perhaps wrong about that, I'll get that from the record, but who's been involved in hedging and betting, and mostly betting, not hedging, and has made a massive amount of money. He doesn't have any interest in oil. He's never had oil run through his fingers. You know, he's probably never changed oil in his car, let alone wanting to buy oil. Wouldn't have a place to store it if he got it. Very interested in gambling on the contracts, back and forth to make money. It's what Mr. Gates said. Mr. Gates described it, and as I indicated, Mr. Gates is a fellow who has over 30 years' experience. I've talked to him by telephone a number of times. Mr. Gates says, this is the world's largest gambling hall. It's open 24/7, totally unregulated. Now, we've seen speculation and bubbles exist in our country before. We've seen them in history. There are books written about bubbles and speculation. You know, when tulip bulbs were sold for $25,000 a piece 400 and 500 years ago, didn't matter so much. Nobody needs to have a tulip bulb to do well during the day, right? But oil is different. The price of oil affects every American, every consumer, every business. It affects our economy. What are we going to do if this price keeps moving and if we don't find a way to wring the speculation out of this and bring this back to where supply and demand or where a real marketplace would render the price to be? How many airlines will we see go bankrupt? How many airline companies will no longer be around? Will we have trucking companies be able to purchase this fuel? What will consumers do? What will it mean to the economic growth potential of this country? Mr. President, I'm working on a piece of legislation that does a couple things, that addresses this speculation in a way to try to wring it out of the futures market. The futures market should exist. It's a legitimate market. The futures market for oil is necessary. You need to hedge. But we need to find a way to have complete transparency, be able to regulate both here and also on the intercontinental exchanges, probably increase margin requirements, and say to speculators, your day is over. Your day is done. This market will exist, but it'll exist without you. And I intend to work on that amendment with my colleagues in the coming days and offer it and hope that we can push it to a conclusion. Mr. President, I yield the floor and I make the point of order that a quorum is not present.